Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengraber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hi, it's Stephen Donziger.
Hello, this is Paul Holdengraber calling you from the Quarantine Tapes. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. I'm really very grateful.
Oh, my pleasure, Paul. It's good to talk to you.
It's good to talk to you. Tell me, where do I find you at the present time, and how have you been living this wild, delirious quarantine?
Well, right now I'm in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, New York City.
Yeah.
In my apartment where I've lived for about, 12 years or so with my wife and 14-year-old son. And we're all home. It's kind of a cloudy, cold day. It's starting to get dark here on the East Coast. And I'm in my kitchen talking to you with an ankle bracelet on.
Why do you have an ankle break on?
I'm under house arrest.
That's what you mean. That's what you mean. Yes.
Yeah, I have a what we call the Black Claw, which is a GPS tracking monitor, which was put on my ankle on August 6, 2019. It's now been 504 days. I'm charged with criminal contempt of court. Long story, but I haven't had a trial because of COVID, and it's a misdemeanor, meaning it's a petty offense. And as I understand it, I'm the only person in America charged with a misdemeanor who's being held in custody prior to trial. And because of COVID, the courthouse is closed in New York. There's hardly any trials happening. And it's unclear when I'll get a trial, and it's all kind of messed up. But my point in telling you all this is the COVID pandemic has been a kind of a double, triple whammy for me and my family. A lot of people have to obviously stay at home or can't lead their lives that they were used to leading. On top of that, I can't even walk out of my apartment without getting permission of the court. So, and I'm a 59-year-old man, lawyer, went to Harvard Law School, and I'm just been stuck here for over 500 days. It's been kind of difficult and challenging and interesting on many levels.
Well, you've said actually that you're like a corporate political prisoner, and in a sense, Stephen, you've, as you put it, you've experienced quarantine a bit earlier than the rest of us. Is that a correct assessment in a sense?
It is. I just hope it doesn't go beyond what everyone else is going to experience, because, it's a little scary to be put in this situation where you don't really feel like you're being treated in a fair manner by the court system. It's just deprived me of my ability to earn income, and it's been complicated. But yes, I've been in quarantine for 504 days. So, but when the pandemic really hit in New York, which was, I'd say, in the middle of March of this year, I had already been in detention in my home, quarantining, quote unquote, for over 6 months at that point.
Stephen, could you tell our listeners actually what you've been charged for, and perhaps what we could do is talk about Lago Agrio and why it is called the Amazon Chernobyl, and what you've been doing for the past 2 decades working on this case and what has come of it. I mean, we know now what your situation is at the present time, but you've been working on this case for, I think, nearly 3 decades.
Yes, for 27 years. Sure. This will take a couple of minutes.
Please, we're not in a rush.
I'm gonna try to summarize, 27 years of history in a couple of minutes. The high points,
even 5, please.
Okay, thank you. The high points are basically this. When I had just gotten out of law school in the early 90s, I went to Ecuador in South America in the Amazon at the invitation of a man who was a lawyer who had heard about what was called the Amazon Chernobyl, what he described as the world's worst oil-related pollution disaster. And when I got there with this group of doctors and lawyers and investigators, we discovered really an apocalyptic nightmare where Texaco, now Chevron, had been in this area for, at that time, 25 years and had systematically dumped billions of gallons of toxic oil waste onto indigenous ancestral lands in the Amazon rainforest, and literally had wiped out the ability of these indigenous groups to survive and prosper off of the ecosystem as they had for millennia. And not only that, like there were about 1,000 open-air toxic waste pits that had been gouged out of the jungle floor. The company had put pipes on the sides of these pits and to run off their cancer-causing contents into streams and rivers that locals relied on for their drinking water. When some of the indigenous leaders questioned these practices, they were told by Texaco's engineers that this was all fine and, that the oil was medicinal and it was like milk and contained vitamins and it was not a danger. And over time, the company really created what we call a mass industrial poisoning of the 1,500 square mile area that over the years has without doubt, killed thousands of people with cancer and other oil-related illnesses, including young children who get leukemia as infants. I mean, if you can believe it, because, people don't have access to anything other than natural water sources. There's no faucet you turn on as you would in a normal kind of home in the developed world. You get your water from rivers and streams and, sometimes wells that go into the groundwater. And all of that became poisoned by this deliberate decision by Texaco, now Chevron, to systematically dump toxic waste as a cost-saving measure. This wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. It was part of their engineering design, and it's ended up killing a lot of people, and it was easily foreseeable it would kill a lot of people when the plan was implemented. Of course, the oil company thought it could get away with it. And, when we got down there in 1993, we decided at the request of the people we met, some of the people we met, to represent them in court and try to seek a remedy and try to hold Chevron accountable. And, over the years, they've fought us every step of the way. They've used 60 law firms, 2,000 lawyers. We put together a legal team. We ended up winning a huge judgment against them in an Ecuadorian court. The evidence against Chevron was overwhelming. 64,000 chemical sampling results, 100-plus expert evidentiary reports. And when we won, and the case has been affirmed on appeal by 4 different appellate courts in Ecuador, and it's also been affirmed by Canada's Supreme Court, Ecuador's Supreme Court, for enforcement purposes. They decided not to pay. They vowed never to pay. They threatened the indigenous groups with, quote, a lifetime of litigation if they did not drop the case. So rather than comply with the rule of law and comply with the judgment in the courts where the trial was held, where they had accepted jurisdiction, they attacked me and they sued me back in New York for $60 billion. And I'm a human rights lawyer. I'm not a person of means, live in a relatively modest apartment. And they decided to accuse me of being a racketeer, trying to claim the entire case that we had won and that I had worked on for many, many years was a fraud and was what they called sham litigation. And even though the court in Ecuador that looked at the evidence and understood the case better than anybody had affirmed the judgment, they decided to take it to a judge here in New York who's a former tobacco industry defense lawyer. His name is Louis Kaplan. He denied a jury, and they charged me with the civil offense. And They paid a witness $2 million to come in and claim I bribed the judge in Ecuador, which is completely false. That has been rejected by, courts all over the place. And this witness, his name is Alberto Guerra, later admitted having lied repeatedly before Judge Kaplan. Judge Kaplan still credited his testimony, ruled I had committed fraud, and, issued a judgment that I'm a racketeer. But it was a civil case, and they had dropped all their money damages claims against me on the eve of trial to avoid a jury. And so I had sort of like this judgment against me, but it wasn't for money. It wasn't for, criminal liability. I didn't go to jail. And I kept working on the case. And as we began to make progress to enforce the Ecuador judgment against Chevron's assets in other countries, they came back to Judge Kaplan trying to claim I shouldn't be working on the case. And he ordered me to turn over my computer and cell phone to Chevron, which is, I believe, unlawful and unheard of. Like, you don't order a lawyer to turn over his confidential case file to opposing counsel. And when I appealed that order, Judge Kaplan then charged me with criminal contempt of court and had me locked up. And what's really scary about this is the judge who charged me is the same judge who locked me up. Judge Kaplan has financial interest in Chevron. He appointed another judge who has ties to Chevron because she's a member of the Federalist Society, which is funded by Chevron. And when the U.S. Attorney's Office rejected the case, Judge Kaplan appointed a private law firm to prosecute me in the name of the government. And this private law firm, it's called Stewart and Kissel, has Chevron as a client. And that was never disclosed to me. So I'm essentially being prosecuted in the name of the government, deprived of my liberty in the name of the government without trial by a Chevron prosecutor. I'm being prosecuted by a private corporation, and that's why I'm in my home. So the conflicts of interest in this
incredible.
case...
Yeah, it's incredible.
And really, I just want to say this final point. It's scary, okay? Because what's happening to me should scare the heck out of every lawyer and every corporate accountability advocate, every environmental justice advocate in the United States of America and beyond. Because it is outrageous that a private corporation can wrest control of the governmental power to prosecute, to try to silence and bankrupt its main critic, which is what they're trying to do to me.
Why do you think initially your trial was held in Ecuador rather than in the U.S.?
Well, that's a very good question. It was because Chevron wanted it held in Ecuador and agreed to accept jurisdiction in Ecuador and agreed to pay any judgment against them that might come out of Ecuador's court, all as a way to avoid a jury in the United States. Because remember, the Ecuadorians initially filed the case in New York. It was Chevron that wanted it in Ecuador, and it was Chevron that accepted jurisdiction in Ecuador. And then when they lost the case in Ecuador, suddenly they're like, well, we're not paying even though we accepted jurisdiction. So, Chevron, and I think this is true of all the big fossil fuel companies, they play games with the law. They play games with the court system. They try to manipulate the court system in their favor, and they basically only respect judgments where they win, and anytime they lose, they blame the court. I mean, this is what's happening in our case right now.
So what kind of challenges have your collaborators in Ecuador faced as a result of their involvement in this case?
You mean what challenges of the Ecuadorian victims of Chevron's pollution face?
Yes.
Okay, that's a great question. I mean, life is enormously difficult. I mean, imagine living in an environment where you cannot access clean water.
Right.
Either to take a shower, to bathe, or to drink, or to cook with. Imagine an environment where you rely heavily on fishing in the rivers and you can't get clean fish, or you rely heavily on natural medicines in the forest, and they're no longer what they once were. You're used to breathing clean air, and there's all this gas flaring at the well sites that spews cancer-causing dioxins into the air that you have to breathe. And then there's a black rain phenomenon where it rains and the soot all gets in the rain, and You can't even collect rainwater to have clean drinking water. So the people are really struggling, and many have passed. It impacts them, obviously, their physical health, their mental health, their economic health. It makes it so much harder to earn a living. And culturally, in terms of the indigenous groups, it's really devastating. I mean, you can't maintain your historic culture based on the forest.
Right.
Not having money. These people do not have money as we know money, but they're not poor.
Right.
They're wealthy. They're wealthy. They have access to so much wealth, natural wealth. And when they're deprived of that because of the pollution, what really is happening is Chevron is doing violence to their culture, and they're really destroying their culture by dumping toxic oil waste onto their ancestral land such that they can no longer sustain their existence as they knew it. And by the way, there's a word for this. It's called ecocide.
Yes.
Which is a new type of crime that describes a situation where some corporation or some government deliberately destroys the natural environment to such a degree that the people living there can no longer survive and they die. That's ecocide.
Right, a variation on genocide, I understand.
Exactly. And it's an atrocity crime. By the way, it hasn't been accepted yet by international law, but there's a movement globally amongst some of the world's leading atrocity crime scholars to make what the type of thing that Texaco and then Chevron engaged in an international crime punishable under international law. And what Texaco and Chevron did in Ecuador, to me, is the very definition of ecocide, which is deliberately destroying the environment, knowing that the people who live in that environment and depend on it will die, will not be able to survive. That's ecocide, and it really is what happened at Chevron's hands in Ecuador, in my opinion.
Well, Stephen, if this pollution had happened, let us say, in Europe or in the United States, how do you think the case might have played out differently?
Well, that's an interesting question. First of all, I don't think it would have happened the same way in the United States or Europe. I'm not saying oil companies aren't capable of significant acts of pollution in the U.S. or Europe. They are. We have a record of that. But to openly, notoriously, brazenly, systematically build pipes to dump 4 million gallons of benzene-laden, cancer-causing, water production that comes out of the oil wells into rivers and streams that people drink out of to survive. I mean, that's an act of audacity that I don't think you would see in countries that have regulatory systems to at least deal with that in some sort of even modest degree. So, this is the worst oil problem in the world. It's called the Amazon Chernobyl.
Yeah.
And the fact it was done deliberately, it was not an accident. Remember the BP accident in the Gulf of Mexico?
Of course.
That was in 2010, Deepwater Horizon. That was terrible. And BP has paid 50, 60 billion in damages and fines. But that was an accident. This is a product of deliberate design. And Chevron has yet to pay the first dollar to the people it harmed. And I believe that if they had done this in the United States, their executives would have been prosecuted criminally and probably put in jail. Not to mention the fact they would have been forced to pay compensation to, the thousands and thousands of people they harmed.
I mean, it's obvious to say that it's probably obvious why they're not paying. Nobody likes paying, but why do you think Chevron isn't? When after what you described at the beginning was, they were found in fact guilty.
Well, Chevron, like many of the oil companies, the fossil fuel companies, I've found this. I've been in this industry for years dealing with it. They don't respect the rule of law. I mean, they see court systems as just tools of their own power. And in my case, they weaponized the law to try to attack those that held it accountable, like me. So the Chevrons of the world don't look at the law like I do or like the average person does, or even the average company. I mean, they actually look at the law as something to be weaponized to attack their critics and their enemies. And, so when Chevron says we're not going to pay, first of all, it's not completely what's happening. They're not paying the people they harm. What they're really doing is taking massive sums of money to pay their own lawyers to manipulate the justice system in order not to pay the people they harm. If they took that same amount of money and actually paid to clean up, they wouldn't even have this problem, or they could solve a good portion of the problem. So, it's not true to say they're not paying. They prefer to pay lawyers,
right? And the
to
people, who are suffering so much. I was so struck, Stephen, that your first court date, as of recently, was November 4th. Which it's quite a date. And then your second date, equally significant perhaps, is January 19th. Now, do you see some significance in the choices of those two dates, and do you think the second one will be upheld?
I do. I mean, I think the judge who is presiding over my criminal contempt case for not turning over my computer, which, by the way, I believe I'm innocent of this. I had a good faith reason to contest this, and it's on appeal right now. So they don't even let the appeal get decided to determine whether the order to turn over the computer is lawful or not. They're just trying to prosecute me criminally while my appeal of the order is pending. And I think the Judge Loretta Preska, my impression is, I cannot get a fair trial. She's denied me a jury. This is the second time now I've been denied a jury. I think she wants to railroad me through. She signaled she will find me, she'll convict me no matter what the evidence. It's very obvious. She, is a member of the Federalist Society, which is a right-wing pro-corporate legal group in America that is funded by Chevron. Chevron's one of the biggest donors. She won't recuse herself even though she has a conflict of interest. She won't disqualify the private prosecutor who works for a private law firm that has Chevron as a client. She won't disclose basic information about these various conflicts of interest. And, she's trying to make the trial happen on a day when she thinks no one will be watching because this case is getting more and more scrutiny. And frankly, the whole system looks bad.
But you're going to be tried the day before we think we will have a new president.
That's exactly right. However, the courthouse is closed because of COVID, and it's possible, maybe even probable, that the trial will be postponed again, even though I'm in detention.
But do you think if it is postponed, Stephen, obviously one can't make predictions. I always think of Mark Twain's great comment that one can't make predictions, especially about the future. But let's assume for a moment, it's a good one. No, we needed a moment of levity, don't you think? But do you think that? Let's for a moment pretend perhaps that the court case will be in March. Do you think under a new administration things might change a little bit?
Look, I don't think ideally the law should function properly no matter what administration is in power. I want a fair trial. I cannot get a fair trial as this is playing out. If I don't get a jury, I'm not getting a fair trial. I cannot have a Chevron-linked judge the facts, particularly a judge that's already locked me up for almost 17 months prior to trial as the only person in U.S. history. I'm the only person in U.S. history that's been locked up prior to trial on a misdemeanor. And this whole thing is just preposterous. It's obvious what's happening. It's pure Chevron-driven retaliation, helped by two federal judges whom I believe are abusing their power. Judge Kaplan, who charged me, Judge Preska, who was appointed by Judge Kaplan to preside. She has her own links to Chevron. The prosecutor, Rita Glavin, works for a law firm, Seward and Kissel, but Chevron as a client. I mean, I'm being prosecuted by Chevron. How is it that a corporation has taken over the prosecutorial power of our government?
Right.
To to go after the lawyer who held it accountable for the worst environmental disaster in world history. I mean, we need to wake up to this.
You've received support. I need our listeners to know this from 55 Nobel Prize winners and from legal and human rights organizations across the globe. What struck me so much in preparing to talk to you was all of that in mind, Stephen. Have you been surprised by what one could call the relative absence of mainstream media coverage of your trial?
Well, first of all, the amount of support I've gotten has been so gratifying and really pleasantly surprising. I mean, I am just blown away. There's been 25,000 people around the world who've signed up for our campaign. And, it's the website, by the way, if anyone wants to help, it's called MakeChevronCleanUp.com. And 55 Nobel laureates, have demanded this case be dismissed and I be released. Some of the leading, environmental groups and human rights groups around the world, including Amnesty International and Global Witness and Amazon Watch, Rainforest Action Network, the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, the National Lawyers Guild. I mean, so many organizations have insisted that this case be thrown out. So the amount of support that I've received is very, very significant. And, I have gotten some good, fair amount of media attention in the independent media, in America, like magazines like The Nation, or people know The Intercept. Chris Hedges has written a great article. Yes. But you're right, the big publications who I believe are dependent on fossil fuel advertising have largely ignored my story. And, it's amazing because you open the New York Times, for example, and you see stories about, lawyers in Turkey who are having their rights violated and they're in prison. And, here we have a situation where I'm literally 1 mile from the headquarters of the New York Times, like sitting here 500 plus days as a Harvard Law grad.
Yeah.
For on a misdemeanor charge, held pre-trial, only one in the country. It's such an interesting story, and they won't do it.
Right. And I mean, Stephen, in what way do you think actually that your very case sheds light on the challenges we face in dealing actually with climate change?
Well, I think it's central, right? To save the Earth, we need to stop the destruction of the Earth by the fossil fuel industry, by the Chevrons of the world. And I'm not saying they have no role in a sustainable economy, but they have to transition to clean energy. And like the U.S. energy companies, Exxon, Chevron, the big ones, invest virtually nothing in the transition to clean energy, whereas a lot of the European energy companies do. So, they have themselves to blame for the fact they are rapidly becoming less relevant. They're losing money. They are ultimately going to, I think, fade out of being viable companies with long-term futures. I mean, it's happening already. And, so I think, this kind of work that I'm doing, this human rights work, this environmental justice work, that really imposes liabilities on these companies for pollution they cause will force them to pay what they owe, to pay for the harm they cause in a way that will actually change the economic calculus of their future investments. Like if they know they have to actually pay for all the pollution, for the externalized pollution they're imposing on these vulnerable indigenous communities and vulnerable communities all over the world, in Nigeria, Ecuador, so many countries, Guyana, they will then look at these investments very, very differently. That's why they don't want lawyers like me doing this work.
Right,
That's why they're attacking and they're locking up, because it actually increases their financial risk and makes their business model far less viable.
Right.
So they want us off the playing field. And the attack on me is not only an attempt to protect Chevron from having to pay what it owes to the people it harmed in Ecuador. It's symbolic. It's designed to intimidate other lawyers, other campaigners, other activists from even engaging in this work at this level. And listen, this is happening because we were successful. I mean, we were successful at a level that the world has never seen before. When I say we, I mean, I'm talking about indigenous people, okay, with no money, as we understand it in the West. We're able to find people like me to create an economic paradigm to generate revenue, or I should say, donations and actual liquidity that was used to pay lawyers to bring a lawsuit against one of the most powerful, wealthiest companies in the world that was successful.
Right.
Okay. Right. And they now need to stop the model. So I've always said that Chevron's goal is not only to, avoid paying the people of Ecuador. It's not only to win the case. It's to kill off the very idea of the case. But make no mistake about it, the people of Ecuador have won the case. It's been validated by the Supreme Courts of Ecuador and Canada. And Chevron ultimately will probably have to pay. This case is extremely viable. And what's happening to me is really a symbol of how successful the Ecuadorian communities have been. I mean, the fact that Chevron and these judges have to engage in such desperate, obviously illegal measures to detain a human rights lawyer in his home for over 500 days without trial, when he was refused to turn over his confidential case file to Chevron. I was acting lawfully. I believe they were not. In any event, it's on appeal. Why do you charge a person criminally in that context? Why am I the only person, the only lawyer in American history charged with criminal contempt for taking an appeal of a civil discovery order? I mean, this has never happened either. So there's so many irregularities in this case that really, I think, demonstrate that this is being driven really for an improper purpose, which is to help the fossil fuel industry, to help Chevron, and it's being facilitated by two federal judges, which is really inappropriate.
Stephen, in a way, you've started to answer the question, but perhaps I can still pose you this question, which is, how do you think your case will be studied, or perhaps differently put, should be studied in law schools? And perhaps, how would you like it to be studied? How would you like the Stephen Donziger case to be studied when it is?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, first of all, it is being studied a lot now in some places. I've spoken to lots of law students, even in this past year, via Zoom from my home. There's an intense fascination with this case. I mean, I think this case should be studied as both an example of the promise of what the law can do to help people,
right,
but also of the ugly underbelly of the law and what it can do to hurt people. And I think the struggle between those two conceptions of the law is being played out every day in this case. We have accomplished so much, but there's so much harm being caused by the weaponization of law to try to silence, advocacy and silence accountability or stop accountability. And the tension between those two strains is ultimately going to be resolved one way or another. And I think studying that and understanding it so the law can be used to fulfill its own promise, and that the law can be used to really obtain justice rather than be used by the fossil fuel industry and other, powerful actors to deny justice. All of those things need to be really studied in the context of this case. This is really the mother of all environmental justice and corporate accountability cases. There's never been a case like it. And frankly, I hope there's never another case like it,
of course,
in the sense of how long it's taken to get some sort of resolution. I mean, I can't tell how many of my clients have passed away, died of cancers, or died of natural causes just during the lifetime of the case.
And
think about it.
Yeah, and
this case started in 1993. I was
younger.
I was 32 years old.
You were younger, and I'm curious, Stephen. You were saying that you have a 14-year-old child at home. What do you say to him or to her?
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, my son has been with me to Ecuador. He understands this to a great degree. He's intrigued by it. He's fascinated by it. He's learned from it. He's learned, I hope, positive things by watching my example. But, it's also extremely difficult to see your father in this situation with an ankle bracelet, meaning I'm locked up in my own home and I can't even he wants to go throw a ball around on a day with nice weather, and I can't do it. We can't travel. We can't do the things that normal families can do. We can't even go out and get a meal, and so it's been difficult for him. It's been extremely challenging for him, in ways that, that we as parents probably can only really scratch the surface of, so it's tough, man. But like life is complicated, right? I mean, and you got to have perspective, and you got to understand that what's happening to me has happened to thousands and thousands and thousands of advocates all over the world, and many of whom have it much, much worse off than I do. Not to excuse my situation, it's inexcusable on every level what they're doing to me. But we also need to maintain perspective. We need to maintain solidarity with other victims of this type of corporate and governmental abuse, not just in the United States, but all over the world. So we have a real broad perspective. We try to teach my son a way that would be productive rather than destructive.
Right.
And it's very important as a family. And my wife and I kind of agreed on this when this first started happening years ago. I mean, this has been going on 10 years, these attacks on me through the law. We're like, we cannot let a trauma turn into a pathology.
Ooh,
you live a trauma, but you can't let it take over your life.
That's right.
So we agreed that in the four walls of our home, we would every day try to create happiness, and we would try to lead a normal life and not lay all this stuff on our son, and I would try to keep a somewhat of a wall between my professional life and my family life and my personal life. So I think we've done a pretty good job of that. But of course, in this kind of environment, when I'm locked up and there's a pandemic to boot, it's hard to keep them as separate as we would like. And we just have to confront it and deal with it. And as my son gets older, he's now 14, that's totally different experience for him than when he's 10, watching this kind of stuff play out. And as it will be when he's 18.
Of course.
And I just want my son to be happy and to do what he wants to do and pursue his passions. And, and we look at this, we try to be positive and look at this as a learning experience for all of us in a positive way as much as we can.
Stephen, you were talking about playing ball with your son. You did play ball with a rather well-known figure in America, namely Obama. And I'm wondering, have you spoken to him about your case as of recently?
No, I have not. Barack Obama and I knew each other pretty well back in law school at Harvard. We've been in touch over the years. He was helpful to the Ecuadorians when Chevron tried to lobby the U.S. government to take action against the government of Ecuador for letting this case happen. That was back when he was a senator. It's possible he and others will look at this. I think everyone should look at this, including elected leaders. We're asking members of Congress to wake up and understand that these judges are abusing their power and committed fraud to pay that witness to try to frame me in this civil case. But I have not been in touch with him really since he was elected president. We were in touch before that, but I have a lot of respect for him. But ultimately, this really transcends who's in power and who isn't. I mean, right. I think it's a mistake to kind of look at this and like, oh, can you get help from this politician? I mean, that's not how it should work. I mean,
right. As you were saying, it shouldn't be that when I was mentioning the 19th of January, it isn't as though an administration should change the rule of law, though I think perhaps we could agree that the last 4 years don't necessarily go in that direction. You in a recent open letter, you wrote the following, and I'd like you to comment on this in closing. You said, "I have learned by working on this case that the abuse of judicial power can only happen in darkness. When people speak up and call it out, those responsible don't want to show their faces. That's because acts of corruption by public officials are at core personal acts of cowardice. Can you say a little bit more about that?
God, that's pretty good. Where did you find that? Wow.
Well, we have our ways.
I actually remember writing that, but honestly, I wouldn't be able to put my fingers on where I published that or when. But yeah, I think, look, I have believed from the beginning that as a lawyer, when you represent people with no money and very little power, you have to fight. You have to fight just for a fair trial. You have to fight for a fair playing field. You have to fight to get into the arena. Like, you can't just file a lawsuit and think you're even going to get a trial. Like, you fight every step of the way to be treated with dignity and to be treated with fairness. And, we're still fighting. And, people who engage in these acts of oppression, who are, whether they're in the legal profession or in politics or wherever, they get more aggressive when they think they're never going to be called out personally, or where they're never going to be found out, or they're never going to be exposed. So, yeah, I mean, we have to, as advocates, illuminate the darkness, the corners of the system, the legal system and the political system, where acts of corruption occur, because they will thrive. These acts of corruption will broaden, they will expand, they will take deeper root without the light shining on people. It changes people's behavior. I mean, we have in my misdemeanor case right now, some of the most prominent lawyers in the world have formed a trial monitoring committee. And it's funny, once they announced their existence, the trial judge seemed to take notice of it and at least tried on the surface to act with a little more coherence with regard to the law, a little more respect for the law. So our philosophy, whether it was representing indigenous peoples in Ecuador's own courts, where we had to fight against Chevron to get a fair trial, to my own personal situation in this misdemeanor criminal contempt case, like, we're fighting for the light to be illuminating everything that happens, because without that, those who commit these abusive acts feel more emboldened, they feel more confident, and they think they can get away with it more and more. So I think what I said, the quote you read, is very true. And, if you had said, hey, I just read this quote, I would agree with it. I'm it sounds really good. I'm actually surprised I wrote that. It sounds really, really.
Well, I'm glad to bring you the good news.
Thank you very much. And you obviously do your research, but that's so true, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, look what Donald Trump got away with, and is still getting away with, by operating without scrutiny and doing all these things that you don't even notice. We're going to keep learning about this when the new president comes in the United States. People are going to be like, what? He did that too? And, we need scrutiny. We need accountability. We need transparency. We need honesty. But, those things are not given. They're not given. You have to go force them to happen as an informed citizenry. And that really means all of us. And that's why this interview is so important to me. And I thank you again for it. People need to wake up and see what's happening to me and understand that I'm the canary in the coal mine, man. Like, what happens to the next lawyer who brings a successful, pollution case against a big oil company? Do they also get locked up? Do they get sued for $60 billion? This has to stop. The work we lawyers, human rights lawyers, do is vital to fundamental justice and the survival of the planet. Because if polluters can pollute with impunity and never be held accountable, and when they lose court cases, they don't have to pay, they can just run away and threaten people like Chevron is doing, they're never going to have an incentive to change their business model, and the acceleration of planetary destruction will continue. So the work I do, the work my colleagues do, is absolutely vital to the survival of a free and democratic society and a sustainable economy. And if people don't sort of see the connection between this legal assault by Chevron on me by manipulating the U.S. justice system and sort of a lot of the other challenges we face as human beings on this planet in terms of our need to survive, have to see that connection. And I have to get through this. Can I just mention real quick how people can help if they're interested in helping?
Of course.
Okay. So just so people know, if you want to help, please go to this website. There's two websites. The first one you should go to is called DonzigerDefense.com, DonzigerDefense.com, Donziger Defense. And you can get all sorts of information about the case. And more importantly, if you feel like you're in a position to help financially, you can donate electronically on the site. The money goes to a law firm in Seattle that administers my legal defense fund. And the money is used to pay legal expenses as well as my household expenses for me, my wife, and my son, so we can survive this ordeal while I'm unable to work because I'm essentially locked up. And then the other website I mentioned earlier, it's called MakeChevronCleanup.com. And that's a website it's an English language site run by the affected communities in Ecuador. You can sign up for the campaign. You'll get regular updates on the case, and you can also take action. Our latest action is to contact certain members of the U.S. Congress and demand they hold a hearing about what's happening here and this abusive process by the judges up here in New York. So, again, the websites are DonzigerDefense.com and then MakeChevronCleanup.com. And if you could go to both of those and sign up for the campaign, and if you're in position to help in terms of making a donation, that would be very, very much appreciated. And by the way, even if you can only give $1, $5, $10, get involved, do what you can, and please try to help us.
Stephen, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you, and it's also been incredibly instructive. And I really hope things turn out in a better way for you soon, and that you and your family and your son will lead a more normal life, and that you'll be able, when the spring comes, to go out and play ball with him.
Well, that's very kind of you, and I want to just compliment you for your understanding of the case and the extremely thoughtful questions. I really enjoyed the interview, and I thank you for the time you took to prepare for it and for caring. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Take good care, and let the future be better. Let us hope.
Okay. Thank you again. I'll talk to you soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.